works. Okay, so everyone should be looking at my RStudio right now, and there, now we are on the literature review slides. Let me pause this, okay. So like I said, Vicky is not here, but she made these beautiful slides that we're going to share with you afterwards. So you're not, you don't have to take tons of notes. Again, I will try to figure out how to pay attention to multiple things at the same time. But I think, we'll do a Q&A afterwards, and Joel can interrupt me if there's anything really pressing. Okay, so literature reviews, right? Like I said, we're going to be working tons with data this summer. You're going to be crunching numbers like crazy, but data is really nothing without context, right? You can't launch a research project if you don't know what your research question is, if you don't know how to narrow things down, if you don't know how to, like, quote unquote, stand on the shoulders of giants, right? It's not just that we've learned E = mc squared and we can build off of that. That's the way the entire scientific community works, right? You're always building on the insights of someone else, regardless of what your field of expertise is. So if I want to, learn something new or research topic X, I want to be familiar with what people have done on topic X before, and what are the outstanding questions that the scientists haven't yet answered in that particular area. So I'll be throwing a couple of examples at you. My own research is mostly in social gerontology, so it might be a little bit biased towards that end, but you can find analogs for whatever field that you are in. So any project, it says here, most projects at ESDAD will start with a literature review, but really any research project should start with a literature review. That will give you the context and the background for the topic that you're exploring and that you're trying to zoom in on. And a literature review is something that helps you do a focused, systematic, and repeatable, and these are all important and we'll go through them, a critical synthesis of what the key research already is in that area, right? And then you can formulate a good informed research question and test it against that background that you have. So for example, one of the projects that I'm working on this summer is in partnership with Fairfax County in Virginia. They're interested in labor force markets and specifically, in how the landscape for employment in Fairfax County is going to change with the impacts of the pandemic. So I don't just want to go into this blindly, right? I'm not a labor sociologist, I'm a health sociologist. Let's say that my knowledge of labor markets is semi-limited. I need to go and do my due diligence, figure out, what are the key factors that shape a labor market in an urban area specifically. I need to know what other people have discovered about how these dynamics change with recessions and natural disasters, things like that, right? I'm not just gonna make things up or just go off of my own opinion. I wanna know what the facts are that I can use to kind of like produce a good research question. So a research question, you've kind of lucked out here because most of the summer projects will all already have a semi-well formulated research question. That's not necessarily the case for all of you. So some of our projects are more exploratory than others, but you have some idea of what you're interested in. And then you can work with that semi-broad question to narrow it down. That research question will prompt your entire search process. It will guide how you search. So it will inform things like the development of your keywords. We'll talk about that as well. And it will guide the selection of your literature sources. So one kind of like special thing about ESDAD or this summer project is that because, we're working on applied projects so much, you won't only be relying on academic literature. So if you're a PhD student and you're developing a paper for publication, most of your literature is going to be journal articles published in high impact journals, right? But for our purposes, you're going to be also looking at gray literature a lot. So those are things like white papers or briefs or reports from different federal agencies or nonprofits and things like that. And we'll talk about that as well. There we go. Another thing that you can get out of a literature review for our specific purposes is ideas about what data sources to use. So once you read, 10 papers on labor markets, you're going to have an approximate idea of what people's go-to data sets are. This is going to be important in your data discovery process. So as you know, we're not just going to, you have some projects where some of the data will be handed to you because they're more or less mature projects and we've been working with that data for a while and you'll keep working with it. But what we're always trying to do is bring in new, fresh, novel, more recent, better data sources. And if you're not very familiar with your topic area, literature is a good place to start. So in my example, the 10 papers that I'm reading on labor force or labor markets or what have you, the word loads might pop up a lot. That's because people are going to a federal data set called the Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics data set, and that's where they're getting information about flows of people between census tracts and things like that. And I might, jot that down and say, oh, this is probably something that we should consider bringing in. And that can send you on a, down a rabbit hole of other data sets that you can use for your project. Okay, so here are some examples of DSPG research questions. I think this is all applicable for this year. The Business In project that we have at UVA is interested in how to determine whether a company has launched a new project. How do we go about doing that? With our Gates economic mobility projects, we're interested in various definitions of economic mobility. So what is it? How are people defining that? What is the best definition for our purposes? What are the drivers of economic mobility? So what are the key factors that will predict whether or not someone will exceed the socioeconomic status of their parents or something like that? In the ARI, Army Research Institute Performance Project, we're interested in survey instruments that are used to measure performance. What are they pluses and minuses? What are they useful for? And what are the typical cognitive and non-cognitive measures of performance that people are using in examining soldiers? So when you look at all these research questions together, one thing that stands out is that they're all fairly specific. So what you don't want to do is start with an overwhelming, extremely wide research question that will be impossible to answer. So you have to take into account your various constraints. So for this summer in particular, we only have 3 months. You do not have 3 full months to do a literature review. If you're doing a PhD, you're in a very different position. You probably have 3 years to become the utmost expert on your topic, and you will never stop reading on your research question. But if I throw something at you, as that's like, what is the lifestyle of older adults like? That is way too broad, right? There's no good way to synthesize literature on a question that's that broad, but we might narrow down to something like, how often do older adults age 65 and over travel abroad, right? That's more manageable, that's more specific. That might give me some keywords that I can use when I go into the various databases and look at various journals. There are some trends that I can synthesize, and there's something specific that I can look for in my data to answer that. So you don't want to start with a research question that is too broad. You also don't want to start with a research question that can be answered in a specific word, but there's a happy medium there that you'll work out with your project team, with your stakeholder, with whoever your project sponsor is and that you're working with. So the literature review process, when you're doing it, quote unquote, for real, is fairly standardized. So there are guidelines put out by a couple of different organizations for how to do this. If you are in a field that does a lot of this, you'll also notice that there are several different approaches to literature reviews. Some are, there's meta reviews, there's the systematic review, there are different purposes that you can use this for, and depending on the purpose, these steps might be a little bit different, but in general, what they follow is first, like we said, formulating a research question that is well scoped, and then developing and validating a review protocol for how you're going to approach the search, what you're going to do. So as we go forward in DSPG, you'll hear the words, replicable or I guess replicable a lot, right? We want our research, we want the work that we do to be transparent. You want someone looking at your work 3 months from now to be able to repeat the same thing and get the same results. We don't just want to do that with data, we also want to do that with the literature. So we want to test an approach that says, you know, I'm going to use keywords X, Y, and Z. I'm going to search databases A, B, and C, and I'm going to use these operators. And so the person doing this 3 months from now will probably get approximately the same results, right? You want to jot down details like, we excluded these particular papers that came up because of these reasons. So you need to be able to systematically trace your steps, the things that you did in your literature review, so that someone afterwards can go back and do the same thing. After you've prototyped your approach and it works and you're getting useful results, you perform your search, you screen the literature that's coming up for inclusion. So, you know, you might do a really good targeted search. But for example, if I'm doing a search on, I don't know, travel behavior, and I'm only interested in older adults' travel behavior, not the travel behavior of 18-year-olds, there might be some papers that will kind of slide into my results because maybe I forgot to include a keyword or the keyword wasn't good enough. So you want to be able to say, or, you know, develop a criteria for inclusion that says, well, if I end up with a paper that's actually about teenagers and not older adults, I'm going to ignore that paper. So that's what we mean when we say we screen the literature for inclusion. We want to assess quality. So this is a really important step. I alluded to that when I said gray literature. So usually what you want to be looking at are high quality journals with high impact factors. That is something that I don't really want to go into right now, but you know, if you're doing a PhD and you're really familiar with your field already, you start to develop an intuition for which journals are the top journals in your field. Those are the journals that you want as your publication outlet, but they're also the journals that you want to be getting information from because they've already been screened for quality quite extensively. In the past couple of years, you probably heard a lot about predatory journals. So that's a thing now. You know, I get 10 emails every day that say, Teja, submit a paper to our journal. It will just cost you $2,000 to publish and you're all good. No one's even gonna, you know, look at the paper. It can be complete crap. We'll publish it. Right? That's because in the background, you have these dynamics of the academic publish and perish, where it's important for my career advancement to keep publishing. And so I have an incentive, you know, to publish regardless of quality. So we try to, obviously, that is a horrible thing. And we could talk about that for, you know, another 2 hours, but you want to avoid those kinds of journals. If you're just starting out, it might be hard to tell if a journal is a legitimate journal, and if it is a legitimate journal, how good it is. Is it an esteemed journal? Is it like a mid-tier journal? Is it, you know, your last resort if you really have to publish something? So there's a thing from, I think, the Web of Science and a couple of others that I'll show you on the library website that basically shows you the impact factor of journals. And that might be one metric that you look at initially if you're unfamiliar with your field. But in general, you should be able to also, you know, tell there should be some warning signs if you're looking at a paper that looks a little bit sketchy, that will tell you this might not be the best source of information for you. Another thing is the gray literature that I mentioned. So that's kind of like a cross between academic publications and things that nonprofits or think tanks will put out. Usually they're based on, you know, academic research, or they're summarizing academic research, or they're publishing in-house research, but they might not go through peer review that is as rigorous as it would be in an academic journal. So for those of you that are undergrads, and maybe I'm throwing out things here that don't make any sense, peer review is the process that you go through when you're trying to publish an academic study. So, you know, if I work on a study and I complete it and I write the manuscript, I provide all the data, I provide the replicable code, then I send it to a journal, and the journal assigns 3 independent reviewers. The review is double blind, so the reviewers don't know who I am. I don't know who the reviewers are. The reviewers will read all my whole manuscript, and they'll say, okay, explain this, 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 and this. Why did you make this and this and this decision? There will be some back and forth, and at the end, they'll decide whether or not to publish my paper. So the good journals that are out there all have, you know, double-blind peer review process. That's kind of how the scientific community screens for quality. Anyway, Once you're done assessing the quality of the articles and reports that you've gathered for your literature review, you'll extract the data. So you will do a focused read of your literature, looking for the information that you need, and you'll pay particular attention to how the study was conducted so that you know the pros and cons of using that particular point of, the fact or the information that you're trying to extract. And then you'll look at everything that you've gathered as a whole and try to synthesize that information. So what a literature review is not, is just, a free-for-all narrative report of what you've read. So you're not just regurgitating the facts to me. You want to structure it as if you imagine a pyramid, from a top-down, broad to narrow, like summary of, here's my research question, here's what's been done on the research question, and then using the information that you read, narrowing that down to here's what we already know, here's what we don't know yet. This is the question that the literature hasn't responded yet. So it's a critical assessment of what's already out there, how good it is, and what it is that your project contributes to that quote unquote body of literature. So you're trying to add to something. You're not just saying this person found this person found this person found this, and this person found this, and this is what we're doing. You're trying to say, this person found this, and there's 3 others that found a similar thing. But here's the interesting point. They didn't take into account, I don't know. So for example, when I'm doing research on informal caregiving for older adults, I can say, okay, we know that if informal caregivers are stressed out, their mental health is really bad, or it becomes really bad over time. And there's 10 other, researchers that found the same thing. But none of these researchers controlled for things like comorbidities or depressive symptoms, or, they failed to look at the dynamics between the caregiver and the care recipient. So we still need to figure out what it means if the informal caregiver is stressed out. Does their care recipient survive longer? Do they, develop symptoms of anxiety as well? So you're trying to carve out a gap there that your project is going to address. So you also report your findings out in this structured way. So if you're taking one thing away from this last part that I talked about, is don't just repeat what people have been saying. This is a focused, narrow, very specific and critical assessment of what you've read, not just a repetition of points that someone else made in a different paper. We cited here something that we might want to just try to get from the library website later, maybe as a practice thing, and I'll show you. So this paper has more information on all the steps that I just outlined. Okay, here's the steps in more detail. So this will repeat some of it, and then we'll go through the library website and I'll show you how to do this in practice. Like I said, for formulating the research question, you're already off to a good start because you're on a project that already has an overarching question. Now you need to decide whether that question is narrow enough, or if in coordination with your team and with your stakeholder, you need to narrow that down further. So I just came out of a stakeholder meeting with Patrick County, where this is exactly what we did, right? We started with this very exploratory, broad, well, we're interested in rural health, and we narrowed it down to, we're interested in transportation and access issues in Patrick County. How is it that people access health services when the hospital is closed, right? So that's a more answerable question. The next step that we do, as I said before, is we develop and validate a review protocol. So in Patrick County example, we'll probably use keywords like rural health or rural health disparities, transportation and healthcare access, car ownership, and then health outcomes, like things like that. And then we'll pilot that, we'll iterate, we'll go through a couple of databases, we'll see what the best journals for what we're trying to find are, and so on. And then we'll actually conduct the literature review search. There. This is what you're going to put into your review protocol. So I already alluded to this a little bit, the search strategies. So you'll be developing certain key search terms. Maybe you'll decide on some sources to start with. You'll probably rely heavily on electronic databases at this particular point in time because none of us will be going physically into libraries. You'll decide on the selection criteria. So we talked about inclusion before. You can also think about factors like publication type. So do you want to be looking at gray literature? Are you only looking at academic literature? Are you, concerned with recency? Are you only going to be looking at studies from the past 5 years, the past 10 years, if you're looking at a very recent topic, maybe you're just looking at the studies that came out, in the last year, right? If you have a COVID project, maybe that is what you'll be doing. You want to lay out your quality assessment criteria. So what is it that you're going to be using to decide whether or not a particular outlet is worth your time? Or you're going to be looking at journal impact factors, how methodologically rigorous did the study have to be for you to look at it? Then in the data extraction stage, how are you going to do that? Are you going to lay this out in what are you going to extract and how are you going to extract it? A useful thing here is to have an Excel spreadsheet with, a bunch of columns, author, year, title of publication, what was the methodological approach, what are the key findings, and what are the limitations to this study, and then maybe a citation. And if you lay it out in that way, you won't have a lot of trouble then going to the next step, which is the synthesis. Right? So how are we going to effectively summarize the information that we've extracted? Given the various different methodological and other backgrounds of the studies that you are looking at. How are you going to weigh the different insights that you've gotten, right? So if there's a study that you have that is very methodologically rigorous, are its findings more important than findings from a study that might be more directly tied to your research problem, but maybe not as methodologically good as the other one? So those are all questions that are going to pop up as you go through your literature review and synthesis process. Okay, I'll swap to the library website, but just to give you an overview. So for those of you that are new to doing a literature search, every university library, regardless of which university you're at, and I'll show you UVA and Virginia Tech, will have some sort of portal. They will subscribe to a number of electronic databases. Electronic library databases are places, or kind of like think of them as the pooling ground for a bunch of different academic journals. And then within those databases, you can search by topic or keyword or what have you. You can start in the electronic databases, and once you aggregate, 10 papers, you can start going through the literature that you're finding in those papers to do a backward search or a forward search. So every academic paper, we'll look through one. If you're not familiar with that, at the end, we'll have a section called references or literature, where they'll be citing all the sources that they've used for their own study. So a lot of the time when you find a very relevant piece of academic work, they will also probably be citing a lot of other similarly relevant pieces. And you can go through that literature, read the titles, see if anything applies to your problem, and then just look for those particular papers. So the UVA library page is here, and you could just Google UVA library, VT library, Virginia Commonwealth Library, whatever, and you'll get to the front page. And then you'll have a bunch of search boxes, and I'll show you how to navigate around this to get at what we want to get. Okay, so I guess I'll skip through these and just show you this on the website just to see if there's anything else. Okay. Okay, we can look at these online. There we go. Okay. So if you Googled UVA library or you typed in library.virginia.edu, and again, this will be more or less exactly the same. It's just a layout difference with Virginia Tech or any other universities that you're at. They'll usually have a generic search box up here. Virginia's is called Virgo. It searches for books, articles, digital materials, and more. That's all great. but it doesn't look through, you know, all the articles that are available online. It doesn't look through all the journals that are available online. This is usually the broad kind of catch-all, you know, it's useful for some purposes, but when you're looking for something very specialized or you already know what your topic is, you might want to dig a little bit deeper. So UVA has this research tab, which if I click here and scroll down a little bit, sorry, it'll take me to this thing called databases. So I already mentioned databases before. Databases will pull a bunch of, they'll search through a bunch of different journals. Once you've been working with this for a while, you'll develop an intuition for which databases are good for your purposes. So I'm just going to click all here. And, you know, if you are a sociologist or a social scientist in general, you probably love, or you will come to love, Academic Search Complete. You'll love, I don't know, let's see, Sage publications. If you are coming from a more like public health background, you might be really into Science Direct because they'll index different things, right? So for social science topics, if you have absolutely no idea where else to start, Academic Search Complete or Academic Search Premier or just anything that's called Academic Search in the beginning will be a good start for you. So for example, here, I'm searching this database now. Here is where you put in your keywords, and these should be familiar to you, right? So there's a bunch of operators that I can use when I'm performing my search. This one is fairly simple. It has and, or not, whether or not I want my keywords to co-occur or not co-occur. There's some, you know, additional filters here that I can use. I want a full text journal. I only want peer-reviewed journal, right? Journals, we talked about this before. Maybe I want to limit this by time. So, you know, only the last 10 years, let's say, or since 2010. There we go. And let's say that I'm interested in, I don't know, let's say health outcomes and in rural areas. Okay, so let's say that with my team, I've decided that some of the keywords that we're going to be using in my search are keywords health outcome and rural area or rural. I can do what I did here. So I want journals or articles that I have access to. I want peer-reviewed journals because that's going to give me some degree of confidence or the first facet screening for what are good journals. I limited this by time a little bit and I click search. All right, so this is now searching all the Academic Search Complete databases for journals that might be, or papers in journals that are available and that are relevant to my question. I get a bunch of different articles here, and you know, then I start reading the titles, I start reading the abstracts, I screen things based on my screening criteria to see which ones actually apply and that I want to download and then read and use in my synthesis. Another option that you'll get either in EBSCOhost or, you know, in PsycInfo, in any Sage database, in Science Direct, any database that you're using, is usually you'll be able to narrow this down a little bit more. So here I'm not narrowing it down, but you know, if I'm interested in health, I might already know that I want sociology databases, I want health science databases, maybe not, you know, computer science. It's very unlikely that a paper on health that's relevant for rural areas and for my particular project would appear here. So let's say I'm also narrowing it down to this. I can repeat my search. This will be a little bit more narrow. So sometimes if you're getting too many results or results that are too broad, this is what would be a useful thing to do, right? So I'm already getting things that are a little bit more targeted. So longitudinal health outcomes and treatment utilization among emerging, early, mid, and older rural adults. That's great. That's exactly what I want. A side note here is that if you're using a citation manager like Zotero or EndNote, a lot of these databases will provide integration so you can export the citation. So you don't want to be typing out your citations manually. You can use a citation manager to do that. But let's just say we're interested in this paper. We can click full text. Great, here's my article. I can get an overview of what's in this article from the abstract, right? They're going to tell me, you know, here's the background, here's what our method was, here's, you know, our early findings or what we found in this paper if it's not a pre-registered study or something like that, and then some of our conclusions. So this is a good first pass before you start reading the whole thing. And then, as I mentioned, you know, obviously this is your content. And at the end, you're going to have a section called references or literature. And if you're doing a backwards or forward search, you might go through these, see if there's anything else here that's really relevant for you. And now that all the journals more or less have electronic identifiers or requirements to put that in your manuscripts, you'll have a direct link to these studies as well. So it used to be that you had to, you know, copy, paste, and search for these journals. Now I can just click on this persistent identifier and I'll go right to this other paper, right? Perfect, the Journal of Rural Health, right? There's nothing better for me working on Patrick County right now. We're looking at rural health issues. This is exactly the outlet that I want to be looking at. Okay. I have a Virginia Tech site open as well. So again, you know, the differences in the layout. They have a catch-all search box up here, but you can also click advanced search or you can click databases. You'll get to the same thing, right? It even looks the same. So universities will differ on which databases they subscribe to. So there's, you know, a lot of money involved with this. So they might not have all the same ones, but see this close enough. Let's say I'm also a social scientist working on a project at Virginia Tech. I'm going to go to Academic Search Complete. I'm going to click on this. And now I can't log in because I'm out of Virginia Tech. But after you logged in here, you would basically get the same search interface that I just showed you for University of Virginia. Go. Okay, so that's what this part looks like, right? So for your purposes, you're going to go to databases wherever they are on your library website. Once you're a little bit further ahead, or if you're a PhD student, you might go to specific journals. So if I'm a sociologist of medicine, I know that I want to go to the Sociology of Health and Illness, which is a journal. I want to go to Social Science and Medicine, which is another journal. I can just go directly there. You might not need this at this point. So for, you know, your purposes, I would just be looking at databases. And I can also send you guys another, I guess, handout that I compiled with some database names. If you're just starting out and don't know which databases would be good for you, that might start you off. I'll post it later. So we just reviewed this. This is your database section. That's how you get to them. If there is an article that you really, really want, but it's not available through a database, or your library doesn't have a database subscription, or it doesn't have the journal subscription, you can also request papers from interlibrary loan. So at UVA, this is called Iliad. I think you have to be registered, but I guess that was part of your onboarding and setup. You can try this out at this link and see if you're able to request things. This should not be a very frequent occurrence because UVA library is pretty good and so is VT. But if, you know, there is an article at some point that you really want, but you can't get it through the library, then what you want to be looking at is the interlibrary loan. You will usually get your paper delivered electronically in a couple of days. It takes 2 or 3 days for them to find it, for you, scan it and send it. Another good thing that you can get through your library, and this is also the case for both UVA and VT, are a couple of cool data resources. So for most of your projects, you might want to look at PolicyMap at some point in time. PolicyMap is like an aggregator of various different publicly available data sets. They do some of their own data transformation and then they deploy it in this pretty dashboard. If you are looking for data ideas for your project, this might be a good place to go. So again, you go to the library website, you search for PolicyMap, you log in, and you'll get access to this. And when you're exploring it, you know, let's say you're interested in Superfunds, it'll plot it for you, but it'll also tell you what the source of the data is. And then you can go directly to that source, explore, see what else is out there. It's a good, I guess, playground if you're not very familiar with what data sources there are for your particular topic. PolicyMap is a good first place to look at. Okay, there we go. So this is another screenshot from UVA that has a list of data resources that might help you. This link will be on the slides that I will send you afterwards. We can also look at it right now. So the UVA library has a blog. The Virginia Tech Library has a blog as well, where they've already compiled some data sources to start you off with. So you might want to scroll through this as well if you're on a project that doesn't have data yet. Let's see. Okay. Okay, so we have another slide of gray literature. So I've labored this at this point. Again, gray literature, kind of a cross between really rigorous peer-reviewed academic studies and everything else. You will want to draw a line somewhere, but because we are working on very applied projects, it'll probably be unavoidable for you to be reading through a bunch of reports, briefs, conference proceedings, things like that. Google Scholar is a resource that you can use for that. I wouldn't necessarily use Google Scholar as my primary research tool. Otherwise, I would go to library databases. But Google Scholar for something that's, you know, a little bit more just background research and reading rather than something that you're necessarily going to integrate into your literature review is perfectly fine. Now that open access is a thing, the directory of open access journals might also help you. And again, you can either Google this or it will be a link in the slides that I'll share with you. There's a little bit more on gray literature. So if you Google this or use this guide, so all the libraries, this screenshot is from Bow Valley College, all the libraries will have guides, you know, they'll try to explain the things that I'm explaining to you right now. They have a good overview of what gray literature is and when to trust it versus discard. So a couple of other things that I didn't mention here are theses and dissertations, committee reports, all the government documents, technical reports. So those are examples of things that you know, that's pretty legit. You can include that. You know, with blogs, you might want to think twice. With podcasts, you might want to think twice. Those are not necessarily scientific outputs. We have some more on backward and forward search. So backward search I already mentioned. So let's say you read a stellar academic piece. It's a great article. It suits your research question perfectly. It provides a ton of background information. It's very likely that that paper is going to have a bunch of references that are also relevant for your work. So if you go through their reference list and just read through the titles, you'll find other outlets that are either journals that are good for your topic or that are papers that you can bring into your own research. A forward search is what we went through. So, well, not exactly. If you went the other way, so if I have a really good paper, then I can go through something like the Web of Science or Google Scholar and find all the papers that have cited that paper. So if it's a really seminal one, then it's high chance that a lot of people have built on that work, which means that they've also cited that paper in their work. And maybe you're interested in those papers. So a forward search would show you those results. The operators we've already touched on. So this I think is fairly intuitive. So if I wanted 2 words or 2 phrases or keywords to co-occur, you can use things like and or not. These are really common. You can probably use them in every database that you search through and every journal that you search through. And then there's usually some sort of help button that will tell you if there are other operators that you can use. So some databases have really extensive operator support and some of them don't. That will really depend on the database that you're searching through. But that will help you tailor your search, especially if you're getting results that are too broad or results that are too narrow. Okay, so here's an example. So keywords are something that you derive from your research question. If your research question is well defined, you'll be able to get a good results pretty fast. If not, that might be a warning sign that maybe you're searching too broadly. Here we have an example from our ERS broadband project where we're concerned with what the impact of broadband deployment is on rural prosperity. And in particular, we're interested in impact on property values. So some of the things that I would, or keywords that I would use to do a search on this topic right, are coming directly from the question. If you just write it down, it's going to pop out right at you, right? For broadband, I maybe want to go for synonyms, and I want to search for internet, DSL, cable, fiber optic, satellite, wideband. I want to know what's happening in rural areas. So instead of using rural as a keyword, or in addition, I want to search for literature that mentions non-urban or rustic or agrarian or country. And for property values, right, you can say property value, but you can also say housing price or home value. Or if you're looking for farms or more rural, since our context is rural, you might say farm values, and a related idea would be property taxes. So all the combinations of all these keywords might be something that you'll use in your search to get at the literature that's done work in your broad area. So synonyms are usually super helpful. Again, just to remind you, you have to be systematic about the process. You want people to be able to replicate what you did and get the same results. So after you've piloted your approach, you want to record the number of records that you've gotten. I've identified 50 papers from the first database and 60 papers from the other database that I searched. Some of these were the same papers. That will happen very often. So I removed the duplicates, and there were 15 of them, right? You want to be keeping track of this. And a lot of the time people will show this in this kind of like diagram structure. You'll screen for inclusion. Like we said, this can be kind of like a two-step procedure. One is using the abstracts and I showed you an abstract before, to figure out if this paper really talks about what you're interested in. So sometimes it'll look from the title like a paper is related, but it will turn out that it's not, maybe because it's looking at a different population. So think about my teenagers versus older adults example, or there'll be something else, maybe a paper is coming from a computer science discipline where they're not really interested in social determinants of health. They're just, piloting a new machine learning approach to looking at health outcomes or something. So I'll discard that. And the second level of this assessment is then based on skimming the whole text after you've passed that first list. Inclusion and exclusion criteria that we've already talked about. This can help you narrow if you're getting too many results. Look at a time period. Are you interested in papers that were published in the past 5 years, 10 years, just last year? Are you only looking at urban areas, only rural areas, only literature that's been done on, or research that's been done on US populations, or worldwide, or just country X, if you have a problem about country X. Sometimes the observation unit will help you define this. So a lot of you are working on projects that incorporate geospatial information. Maybe you need things that are describing census tracts rather than entire states. So those are all helpful things to include here. Once we're through that process, and again, this is kind of like our diagram growing, right? So we've removed duplicates of these, then we've screened the remaining, I forget my math. Let's say we have 50 papers that are left at this stage, and we've excluded 11 of them because they weren't about the US or because they were written in the 1980s, then they're not relevant anymore. So in addition to jotting down these numbers, do make sure to track why you've discarded something, right? So that's all those criteria that we've decided on. Here's what this diagram looks like when it's completed. And like I mentioned, a lot of this is very structured. So there's organizations out there that tell you exactly how to do this, how to walk through all these different steps. Prisma is one framework for what they call transparent reporting of systematic reviews and meta-analysis. So if you Google Prisma, or you go to this digital identifier, it will take you to the website. They'll show you the same type of graphic. So this is, this is the ideal case. To the extent that you can, you should be mirroring the structure. Oops. And the last step, so here's the paper that we'll also send you in case anyone wants to take a look, but it's basically a summary of what we talked about. You want to assess the quality, extract the data, which means, you know, actually reading the papers, figuring out what is it that they found and how did they find it, and then analyzing and synthesizing, which is that review write-up part that I said, you know, should not just be repeating the information that you've gathered, but critically assessing it and leading up to the question that you're going to answer. Kind of like identifying that gap in the literature and telling the reader how you're going to be filling that gap. Okay, this is, yeah, I guess there's another slide on this. This is how you report your findings. I keep saying, this is a write-up, but really depending on your audience, it might be different. When you're doing this as part of an academic paper, it will be, a couple of pages doing exactly what I just said. It will be a narrative report that's critical, that's a synthesis that leads up to your question. But if you're writing it up for a sponsor, they might not have time to read, a 50-page paper. They just want a couple of bullet points or an executive summary. So depending on your context, your project, and your sponsor, you might be doing this one way or multiple different ways for different stakeholders. There we go. Okay, so this is an example of, I think we did this last year. In the Army Research Institute project, when we're looking at how non-cognitive attributes contribute to the performance of enlisted soldiers and what are those validated constructs of performance that are relevant. Here's some of the inclusion screens for the studies that we used, right? So just what are the validated constructs? What are the character strengths, persistence, integrity, grit? Those were the concepts that we were looking for. The definitions of the construct have to be there. Do we have access to the instrument that's used because we actually need to read through it, and what was the population that the instrument was measured on? And there was gray literature involved, there was academic literature involved, so there were no restrictions on that. There was an interesting output from this project. So like I said, maybe your final output is going to be a list of bullet points, or it's going to be an executive summary, or it's going to be a 15-page report. But in this particular case, we also made this nomological network where all the constructs were linked to each other depending on how they were linked in the different papers. And this was like an interactive dashboard where you could explore basically the literature review. So this is a very creative take on what you can end up with when you're doing a lit review. So it's absolutely not a requirement that all of you come up with something like this, but you should be striving for quite a rigorous, literature review, and then an output that's useful for you as well as your stakeholder. There we go. I see something in chat. If we have 30 more minutes for questions, I'll check the chat and you can let me know if there's anything that I've gone over too fast. We'll post all the resources, I guess, in the Teams channels. So I'll follow up with these slides as well as with the paper that I referenced a couple of times, and an additional handout for those of you that might not be familiar with databases. And then if you have follow-up questions, you can also always reach one of us, I guess me or Vicky, or your project team leads with questions.
The comment in the chat was just an endorsement about sharing.
Sharing, okay.
So yeah, I didn't mention it at the time.
Okay.
You do have something coming in now, so.
Let's see. How to assess the quality of a journal. Okay, yeah, so when I was talking about journals, right, I brought up this idea of predatory journals. Those are usually very easy to spot, right? So you'll see when you go to their website, it will look probably like not very professional. Things might be a little bit sketchy. They won't mention anything about peer review. They might be based in strange places. You'll develop kind of like an intuition for that. The first thing that I would point you to is, like I mentioned, journal impact factors, and maybe I can Google that and show you. So let's say that you're doing a search on this library website. Okay, and so I'm really interested in this particular, this is an academic article. It's called Rural Healthy People 2020, New Decade, Same Challenges. And this article appears in the Journal of Rural Health, and I've never heard of the Journal of Rural Health before. So how do I know that this is a good journal? If I've had some exposure to this literature before, I can see, oh, you know, the publisher is Wiley. Okay, Wiley is a really good publisher. They house a lot of really esteemed journals. I trust this. But if you've never seen Wiley before and this is not, you know, a stamp of approval for you yet, what I can do is take, you know, this name, the Journal of Rural Health, and then use a journal impact factor service. So let's say if this doesn't take you to it, you can also always log into these through a library website. And I can say, oh, you know, the first page is already showing me a bunch of different journals and all these metrics about them, but I'm interested specifically in the Journal of Rural Health. Let's see what this will tell me about the Journal of Rural Health. Okay, so this is a journal based in the United States. It's published by Wiley Blackwell. I click on this and it's going to say, okay, wow, this journal started in 1985 and it's still ongoing. This is clearly something that's been around a long time. If you're looking at a predatory journal, it was probably started 6 months ago. And the editor of the journal is someone that you've never heard of. Oops, sorry. There's something here called the H index. So any one of these journal impact factor services will have a number of metrics that will help you assess how good the journal is. So this particular dashboard tells me things like, you know, citations per document. So for every article that the journal publishes, what increases, part of what increases the journal impact factor is how many times this paper has been cited. So if I'm looking at this particular paper here that we have, Rural Healthy People, if this is a really good journal article, a lot of people are going to cite it. And that will also increase the impact factor for the journal. So it depends on whether or not they publish quality pieces. And if you have a lot of citations, that's a good thing. Self-citations, on the other hand, are a bad thing. And you can say here, wow, this is a pretty flat curve. So that means that, you know, a researcher that publishes a paper doesn't cite themselves a lot. So this is kind of like citation rigging. So let's say that I wanted to increase, you know, my, I don't know, my kind of like capital in the academic community, and I want to be able to say, oh, my papers get cited a lot. Well, I could just cite myself all the time. You don't want to be doing that. That's cheating. So you want journals where self-cites are low. You want journals where citations per document are high, especially external citations. So there's also within and outside journal citing. So a lot of the times you'll see that pieces that are published in a particular journal cite a lot of other pieces that are also cited or published in that journal. That's fine, but you know, this should be approximately the same. This one shouldn't be, you shouldn't be exceeding, internal citations should not be exceeding external citations. There's a bunch of other metrics that I have here, as well as ads, because I'm not logged in through the library website. But so any one of these, if you Google journal impact factors on your university library, any one of these services will give you similar metrics. And the higher the impact factor, the better the journal, right? And the size of the impact factor will really depend on your discipline. So there's interdisciplinary journals will typically have higher impact factors than subdisciplinary journals. So in sociology, something like Annual Review of Sociology will have like a 5, and then small subdiscipline journals are going to have like a 2 or something like that. And anything under 1, you probably shouldn't be looking at. Let's see, I think we have something else in chat. How do we navigate the process of finding literature for extremely recent issues like COVID, for which many academic papers might not yet exist? Okay, so there's a couple of approaches to that. The first one is you are in luck, because a lot of people are very, very, very concerned with this issue. So there have been a ton of academic efforts to very quickly pull and list the literature on this. So I've seen lists of, all the public health papers that came out with, there have been a lot of rapid publication initiatives by various journals. So there's really been a ton of literature that came out in the past 3 months, and there have been good aggregators of that. So if you send me an email afterwards, I might be able to dig up those links for you. But there's literally hundreds of studies that have already been either pre-registered or are already available on that. So in the absence of something like that, so if you're looking at a different, very recent issue that is not, necessarily COVID, and you don't have a lot of literature on that, you try to broaden your search and look for something that is related. So it's either a similar phenomenon or something that happened in a different period. So let's say you're looking at the recession that might be coming because of COVID. Well, you try to look at the literature on past recessions and take into account, the different circumstances or the different contexts right now, and critically assess how those study findings might still relate or be applicable to what you're looking at right now. So you try to kind of like broaden your question a little bit to, you try to be flexible, accommodate, acknowledge that there are differences, but draw as much as you can from prior studies. Or if you're looking at like a super niche topic, you generally try to find something that's as associated as possible, right? So I don't know, I think about people a lot. You might be thinking of something else, but if there isn't literature on, so something like gray divorce, which is divorce after the age of 50 usually, there hasn't been that much literature when people started writing about this 10 years ago. So they just looked at studies of, midlife divorce, and they tried to speculate about why gray divorce is different. And then as the literature got going, you got more pieces about divorce among people aged 65 and older. But when that was not there, people just had to rely on studies for mid-age adults. So you try to do the best you can. And then for that COVID question in particular, send me an email and I'll try to find you the link. Okay. If we have any other pressing questions, you can post on chat or unmute yourself.